Okay, so today is November 10th, 2018. And we can start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so we are continuing now to work our way through the Anguttara Nikaya, the book of, or the collection of the numerical discourses of the Buddha. And we are currently reading and studying the Book of the Threes. And so we'll start today with Sutta number 45, I believe. Hi. Okay, yeah, Sutta number 45. Okay, now this sutta just says, very simple sutta, it just says that there are three things that are prescribed by the wise, by the wise people in the world. I think the word is pandita. Yeah, that are prescribed by the pandita, by the wise people, and by the sappurisa, by the good people. And so the three things, what are the three things? Giving, or the practice of generosity. Let's skip the second one, just come to the third. The third is attending upon one's mother and father, as prescribed by the wise. So these two, I think, seem to be quite obvious and quite universal across, we say, the major religions of the world. I think all of them acknowledge and esteem the practice of generosity and care for one's mother and father. But then the number two here, it's the more interesting, is called the going forth is prescribed by the wise, prescribed by good people. And the word that's rendered going forth here, it's the Pali word pabbaja, which means the going forth from the household life into homelessness, adopting the life of renunciation. And it becomes a question, whether this is really prescribed universally in the major world religions. Because some of the major religions don't have any kind of established, we call it monastic order, or any kind of a special theme for the life of renunciation. In fact, probably even originally, in original Brahmanism, there was not esteem for the life of renunciation and going forth. So when we look even at the Buddha's suttas, we could see that there was a kind of, under the current of religious harmony, there was a subtle antagonism between coming from the Brahmins towards the samana culture, the shramana culture, the culture of those who made the center of the religious life the adoption of the renunciation. And so the Brahmins emphasized the necessity of marrying and begetting children. And so they became very critical. The Brahmins were very critical towards the Buddha when they encountered the Buddha, and they would even denigrate the Buddha and the Buddhist monks. They would call them, in our terminology today, we would say baldies. They would say, why are you going around with a bald head, carrying an alms bowl? You could be staying at home like us, begetting children, and doing punya karma, doing deeds of merit. Later, it seems some kind of reconciliation was achieved between Brahmanism and the Shramana culture, so that Brahmanism came to, as it evolved into mainstream Hinduism, then it adopted and absorbed the Shramana culture within its own fold. And so there developed various monastic orders, which they call those who renounce, they call them sannyasis. And they used, I think I had checked this term to see whether it occurs in the Pali Canon at all, the word sannyasa. But it doesn't occur. I think I didn't find it either in the Pali Canon or in the Pali commentaries. But that became the term used in the Hindu tradition for renunciation. Could be spelled in either of two ways, samyasa or sannyasa. And those who adopt this way of life are called sannyasis. And so in, I think, the 7th century, or maybe early 8th century, there was a foremost exponent of the philosophy of Vedanta named Shankar Acharya. So he established a large monastic order with several divisions. They call it the Dasa, I think the Dasanamis, those who have the 10 names, because there were 10 divisions of that monastic order. And it was very much modeled, I think, upon the Buddhist monastic order. So the sannyasis within Shankar Acharya's order would shave their heads, and they would wear ochre-colored robes, which actually was a tradition going back before the Buddha himself. But it was a feature of the Shramana culture, which was then absorbed into, by this time, mainstream Hinduism, which was the descendant of Brahmanism. And so it became respectable for the Brahmins, for people from the Brahmin caste, to go forth into the homeless life. But during the Buddha's time, one could see this tension between the Brahmins and the Buddhists and other followers of the Shramanic spiritual teachings. A tension between those who stress the importance, the necessity of leading the household life, and those who sought the ultimate through renunciation. And then one of the features, I think, by which the Brahmanism absorbed the Shramanic lifestyle was developing a scheme of what they call the 4 stages of life. I believe this was laid down in the law books of what came to be the law books of Hinduism. So they call it the 4 ashramas. An ashrama here means not the ashram as like a temple or a retreat center, but it means the 4 stages. So the 4 stages are first Brahmacari, which is the stage of celibacy as a student. So one becomes a student, sort of becoming an apprentice of a Brahminic teacher, a learned teacher, to learn the Vedas and the Shastras from roughly the age of 12 to 24. Then at the age roughly of 24, one becomes a householder. So and at this stage one marries, and one begets children, and one earns one's living by some kind of vocation. If one is a Brahmin, by performing the Brahminic rituals. And one continues to lead this kind of life roughly till the age of 48. Okay, then when you get to be 48, then together with one's wife, now the children are sort of grown up and ready to go out as apprentices on their own. So together with one's wife, one can resort to the edge of the forest. I don't remember the name for this. Does anybody? The third one is? Okay, it has something to do with vana. Vana is like the woods. Vana? Yeah, vana I have. Right. Okay, now I get it. Vanaprastha, that means setting out for the forest. Vanaprastha. I think it has a long A. And then the 4th stage, the final stage, is the stage of sannyasa. So at the stage of vanaprastha, then one goes together with one's wife to live at the edge of the forest, performing religious rituals, starting to learn meditative practices. Oops. Strange. Okay, from roughly, I would say, 48 to 60. Then when you get to be 60 years old, then it's considered okay to take up the life of sannyasa, the life of renunciation. And at the age when one takes up the life of sannyasa, then one gives up any kind of fixed dwelling place, and one just becomes a completely homeless, abodeless wanderer, just traveling the country with one's alms bowl without a fixed residence. Okay, so this was like the ideal scheme of life within orthodox mainstream Brahmanism, or as it evolved into Hinduism. And so ideally, any sort of respectable person is supposed to go through all 4 stages. But guess what happens? What? No, no. Of course everybody dies, but as one is progressing from stage to stage, what happens to 99.9%? Exactly, you get sort of anchored in the life of a householder and doesn't go beyond that. And so maybe in contemporary Hinduism, even amongst the Brahmins, you'll have them leading the life of Brahmacaris as students, then marrying and starting a family as householders. But when you look at the edge of the forest, who is there? Some deer, a few other wild animals, but not many renunciant human beings going out to the edge of the forest. But there does take place within contemporary Hinduism a sort of jump over, I think, from the stage of Brahmacari to the stage of sannyasa. And so there are monastics within Hinduism. Generally, they would ordain in one of the orders established by Shankar Acharya. In one of the 10 subordinate orders established by Shankar Acharya. And then there are some newer contemporary orders like the Ramakrishna Vivekananda order. Okay, so that is sort of Brahmanism, Hinduism, which does come somewhat grudgingly later to recognize the value of the going forth. Okay, now I come from a Jewish background, and I'm thinking, we have wise people within Judaism, but do they prescribe the going forth? Certainly my parents didn't. But actually, even though a life of renunciation is sort of not recognized by mainstream Judaism, but say during the time of Jesus, in that particular period of Palestinian, the history of the Jewish people in Palestine at that time, there were those who went into the desert. That was considered a mode of spiritual practice, to go into the desert in order to lead a life of ascetic practices, aiming to achieve some kind of deeper personal relationship with God, to sort of listen to the voice of God within oneself by going out into the desert. And so the preceptor or teacher of Jesus, John the Baptist, was one who led that kind of life, going into the they didn't have forests in Palestine, so they would go into the desert. And then that desert practice was then adopted by at least by some of the early Christians in Egypt and the Middle East, the Near East, became the seed for the emergence of monasticism within Christianity. In Islam, again, there's no ancient tradition certainly within the Quran, I think there's not a prescription for a life of going forth in the formal sense, but there do emerge kind of a contemplative strain within Islam. They call it the Sufism. The Sufi, actually they have formal orders, Sufi orders. And so one does see a kind of acknowledgement of the special value of going forth, even in these Abrahamic religions in which there's not a formal acknowledgement of renunciation within their scriptural traditions. of course, within the other Indian religions, Jainism, Buddhism, and even before the rise of Buddhism, in the northeast of India, there were many different Shramanic spiritual communities and strains of practice, which were grounded in the going forth as the starting point. Okay, then we come to the verses. And so the verses go from the good people prescribe giving, and then it expands on attending upon one's mother and father, to service to one's mother and father, and to the peaceful followers of the spiritual life. So one supports not only one's parents, but also one supports the renunciants. And then the going forth is indicated here by the underscoring the purposes of the going forth, or the special values and practices of going forth. Harmlessness, self-control, that is, restraining the mind from its natural impulses to flow out in enjoyment through the senses, and then self-taming, taming oneself in order to subdue greed, hatred, and ignorance. Okay, and what's interesting about the second verse, it says, okay, it repeats the main point. These are the deeds of the good which the wise person should pursue. Then it says, the noble one possessed of vision goes to an auspicious world. So it seems that the person who is the subject of the sutta, it's not being addressed to monastics, but it's being addressed to lay people with the understanding that they should practice generosity, they should practice support for their parents, and they should support those who have taken up the life of renunciation. And then in this way, also practicing under the guidance of those who have gone forth, they become possessed of dasana sampanno. So that is implying one who possesses the insight or the direct seeing of the Four Noble Truths. So one who has reached the level of a stream enterer. And so it said that, doesn't say that that person attains final liberation, but it says that the person is still within the world. Sa lokang bhajati sivang. So he goes to a blissful or blessed or auspicious loka, a world of rebirth. Okay, any questions about this? Yes? Wait, it's good if you take the microphone.
Somewhere else in the texts, is there a linkage between giving and going forth? Is giving like foundational?
Oh yeah. Giving, when the Buddha gives what's called the Anupuba Kata, the sequential exposition of the Dhamma, he always begins with giving. And so he begins with the practice of giving, then it goes to sila, to ethical practice, taking up the observance of precepts. Then it goes to the talk on the heavens. So those would be the benefits of practicing giving and sila, moral practice. But then when the listener gains the confidence in the teachings of giving, moral practice and rebirth in heaven, then the Buddha will speak about the dangers, the disadvantages in conditioned existence. And that sort of will open up the mind of the disciple to be able to become receptive to the idea of renunciation.
It's a little far out, but I know that over the last year or so, it's like something which keeps coming to me, that the more we possess, the more difficult it becomes for us.
The more what?
The more we possess in this
Oh,
world,
the more we possess,
the more difficult it becomes for us to transcend. And I know it's not obscure, obviously. I mean, the more we give up, the more we can give up when our time comes. But it's like a conscious decision to be less possessive and less acquisitive.
I think I see your point now. As one practices giving or generosity, then that capacity for giving up becomes stronger until it reaches the point where one can give up and go forth. In fact, the word in Pali, which is usually translated as generosity, But there's a word, this is the Pali word, is taga, Sanskrit is tyaga. Let me make this bigger. The word tyaga has actually two nuances. One nuance is that of generosity. So tyaga is the kind of mental attitude that underlies and that leads to, dana. Dana is the actual practice of giving, but dana springs from an attitude of tyaga, generosity, which is one of its senses. But the other nuance of tyaga is giving up, renunciation. Okay, any other question, comment?
Yes, Bhante. In terms of service to one's mother and father and going forth at the same time, it seems to be difficult because you have that tie to your household.
I think, first I think the service to mother and father is intended primarily for those who remain in the lay life. Though also the Buddha does even tell the monks that they have, they can't generally they can't live at home and perform deeds of physical service to their parents. But quite different, I would say, from Hindu monasticism. I believe in Hindu monasticism, when one becomes a sannyasi, one cuts all ties with one's parents. One actually undergoes, part of the Hindu ceremony of sannyasa is to undergo a symbolic death and funeral service, even a symbolic cremation, so that just as if one has died, and one leaves the house, one's home, and never returns. But in Buddhism, the Buddha himself instructs the monks that they should look after the spiritual well-being of their parents and visit them from time to time in order to provide them with some example of Dhamma practice and provide them with teachings on Dhamma. And even as the Buddha said that it's even permissible for the monks, when their parents don't have a means to support themselves, the monk can go on alms round to collect food to give to their parents. Otherwise, the monk going on alms round is not allowed to go on alms round to provide food to other householders. But in the case of the parents, it's permissible. Okay, well,
Now, Bhante, if this sutra is directed at lay people, right, and householders,
yeah.
why does it begin with teeny mani bhikkhave and mention monks?
What is it? Because the Buddha speaks many suttas to monks, even though sort of the intended target audience would be lay people.
So he's telling the monks to further tell this to lay people then?
I guess so, I guess
Okay.
so.
All right.
Okay, then let us continue. Okay, virtuous. I'm going to pass over some of the very simple basic suttas. So this one, when virtuous renunciants dwell in dependence on a village or a town, the people there generate much merit in 3 ways, by body, speech, and mind. So you could see that the idea is that the people in the village or town have a chance to, say, welcome the monks to their home, to make offerings to them of their basic necessities, to speak to them politely in friendly ways, to ask after their well-being, and then to think thoughts that are imbued with faith and devotion and confidence. And all of those factors lead to much merit. Okay, now we come to interesting how this sutta seems to just completely change the subject. Now we sort of get into the philosophical dimension of the Buddha's teachings. So it's said that there are these 3 characteristics that define the conditioned. 3 characteristics of the conditioned as such. So it's said in the Pali that these are called the Sankata Lakanani. The word lakana means a mark or a characteristic, and Sankata is what is conditioned. And condition means what is made or produced by conditions operating together, functioning together. And so it's said that anything conditioned has these 3 characteristics. So you can say that these three characteristics, usually we speak in Buddhism, we speak about the 3 characteristics of all existence. So what are these 3 characteristics of all existence? No, that's the 3 characteristics here, but there's another set of 3. Abhasara. Yeah.
Impermanence,
Yeah.
suffering, and non-self.
Right. So impermanence, suffering, non-self, anicca, dukkha, anatta. Okay, so this sutta enumerates 3 characteristics, and you can say that these 3 characteristics are a finer analysis or explication of the characteristic of impermanence. So when we look into why are conditioned things impermanent, how do we know they're impermanent? Because they have these 3 characteristics. So what are these 3? An arising is seen, a vanishing is seen, then the third one is the interesting one, an alteration while it persists is seen. So anything that's conditioned, anything produced by the operation of causes and conditions comes into being, it arises, and then at some point it's going to pass out of existence. It will vanish. But even while it endures, it doesn't remain the same. It undergoes change. So in Pali, this is called titassa anyatattam. Titassa, tita means standing, literally that which stands. And then anyata means otherwise, different. And anyatata is difference. So it undergoes difference while it stands. So we could take our bodies, for our physical bodies at the moment of, say, conception or birth, and arising is seen. At the time of death, then the vanishing will be seen. And then from the moment of conception, or the moment of birth to the moment of death, does the body ever remain the same? 2 seconds? No. Okay, then you divide the body down into the cells, and you look at the cells. All of the cells come into being at some point. Then they'll pass out of existence. They say the longest, the cells that last the longest last for something like 12 years. So after 12 years, at most, a cell will vanish. And then in that interval, the cell is in constant interaction with its environment, taking in new materials, passing out waste, undergoing change. Then we divide the cells into molecules, the molecules into atoms, the atoms into subatomic particles, and those subatomic particles too come into existence. At some point they're going to pass out of existence, and while they last, they're always in a commotion, always undergoing change. And then I found there's a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya which elaborates on this. Yeah, this is where Ananda comes to the Buddha, and then the Buddha says to Ananda, and he says, if others were to ask you, what are the things of which an arising is discerned, a vanishing is discerned, an alteration of that which stands is discerned, how would you answer? And then Ananda says, in the case of rupa, material form, in arising is discerned, a vanishing, the alteration while it stands. So that's like the example I just gave, bodily form. Then any feeling, like you could say, if you're, say, experiencing some kind of pain, there'll be a moment when that pain arises, and then at some point, hopefully, there'll be a moment when it passes away. But if you observe that pain while it lasts, you see it's constantly undergoing change. Sometimes it's sharper, sometimes it's a bit weaker, sometimes it might become more stabbing, sometimes more throbbing. Particularly when one is sitting for a long time in meditation. Excuse me. In meditation, one thing, I don't know what has happened. One thinks my leg is so painful. Oh, I wish that pain would go away. It's disturbing my meditation. If only that pain would vanish, then I would be in such blissful concentration. But if one looks at the pain, while it's lasting, one will see that it's actually made up of moments of pain, just occasions of pain. Each one is arising and vanishing. And then if one looks at those moments of pain more and more closely, one will see that those moments of pain are also undergoing change. So feelings, painful feelings, pleasant feelings, neutral feelings, always changing. And then the same with perception, the volitional activities, even consciousness. One moment of seeing arises, in a split second it vanishes, but even while that act of seeing takes place, it's undergoing some change. Okay, so that applies to all of the 5 aggregates. Okay, so those are the 3 characteristics of the conditioned. And this applies to everything within the 5 aggregates, as well as all external material phenomena. Even we could take this particular world system in which we're living, which maybe it came into being, what's the latest conjecture, 13 billion years ago, 15 billion years ago, with the so-called Big Bang. 35? I don't think it's that much. I think it's more between 13 and 15. Okay, then this world system, presumably, if we follow the Buddhist understanding of a world system, there comes the moment of expansion, and then it keeps on expanding, expanding, expanding till it reaches a maximum point of expansion. Then it undergoes contraction and dissolution. And then that's followed by another moment, or another phase of arising, expansion, dissolution, contraction and dissolution, over and over. So we could see arising, that's what the moment of origination, then the vanishing in the state of dissolution, and while it lasts, it's undergoing constant change. Okay, mountains. Okay, this emphasizes the importance, the head of the family, the influence that person has on everybody within the family. So the good, when the head of the family is endowed with faith, then the people in the family who depend on him grow in 3 ways. They grow in faith, in good conduct, and in wisdom. Okay. Otter, basically this is the word translated otter here, atapi. It's pretty much a synonym for right effort. So we have the effort exercise for the non-arising of bad or unwholesome mental states, otter or effort for the arising of unarisen wholesome states, and then otter or effort to endure arisen bodily feelings that are painful, racking, sharp, piercing, harrowing, disagreeable, sapping one's vitality. And it might seem that this was somewhat extreme, this extreme description, but I think one has to bear in mind the living conditions of the monks in the Buddha's time. You know, now we live in well-constructed monasteries which are fairly well provided for, and you know, we have pretty safe conditions relatively outside. But in the Buddha's time, the monks would have to walk maybe 8 months out of the year, constant wandering, encountering, sometimes wandering through jungles and forests where they would be subject to the danger of snake bites, attack by wild beasts, the leeches in the forest. Actually, leech bites are not really painful. It's just that blood flows. So go back on leech bites. well, various other insect bites that are painful. There would be diseases like malaria that one would have to endure, different kinds of fevers, dysentery. And so one needs very strong determination to lead that kind of life. And going on alms round every day just for one meal a day. And today in the major Buddhist countries, when you go on alms round, you could be pretty much assured of getting a surplus of food every day. But in the Buddha's time, if you came to a village which was hostile towards the Buddhists or indifferent, you could just come into the village with an empty bowl and leave with an empty bowl, as happened to the Buddha even on some occasions. And then one has to endure the hunger. And since one has been walking, for hours and hours and hours, you could be very hungry early in the morning. You're going to say something?
Isn't a huge part of going forth faith that you would be provided for?
No, let's say there's faith in the Buddha's teachings, but it's not faith that one is going to be comfortably provided for every day.
No, but trusting one's good deeds or karma that
I don't think necessarily, no.
But also, isn't there something that says that they lived usually closer to the villages?
Well, the Buddha's major monasteries were established fairly close to the major cities of the time, like Rajagaha and Shravasti. But during a good part of the year, the monks would not be staying at the major monasteries, but they will be traveling through the country. And of course, it's not the case that one is going to be meeting these painful, racking, sharp feelings all the time, but they will arise.
Bhante, may I ask a quick question?
Oh yes, please.
Bhante, you were talking about how certain villages may not give alms to monks. Is it permissible for monks to have fruit in the forest? Is that permissible?
Yeah, it was not permissible for them to pluck the fruit themselves or even to pick up fallen fruit. But if they have a lay attendant, then they could point it out to the lay attendant, and the lay attendant could pick the fruit up and then offer it to them.
Sure.
Oops. Okay, next sutta is called the Master Thief. It's quite amazing how the Buddha, who lived a very virtuous life, knows about the techniques that the thieves use to get away with their theft. Okay, so possessing three factors, a master thief breaks into houses, plunders wealth, commits banditry, and ambushes highways. So what are the three? The master thief depends on the uneven, depends on thickets, and depends on powerful people. So how does the master thief depend on the uneven? Okay, the master thief depends on rivers that are hard to cross and on rugged mountains. I guess the sense here is that the thieves have their dens where they stay when they're not committing the theft. And so in order to avoid capture by the kings, by the police, the king's authorities, the master thief will cross they'll be skillful in finding a way to get across the river and find some hiding place deep in the mountains. And so the king's authorities can track them down there. And how does the master thief depend on thickets? So the thief depends on a thicket of cane, trees, and so on. I guess the sense here, anybody have any experience as a master thief? Is that after committing the theft, the thief will go into a thicket and hide there and maybe deposit the loot that they steal, deposit it there so that if the the police come trying to track them down, they won't be able to find the loot. Okay, but the thief doesn't always have to cross into these rugged mountains or hide the loot, since the third strategy of the master thief is to depend on powerful people. So here the master thief depends on kings or royal ministers. So he thinks, if anyone accuses me of anything, these kings or royal ministers will dismiss the case. Sounds very contemporary, no? And so if somebody accuses him and says, you committed that theft, then he'll say, well, if you want to accuse me, report it to the chief minister or to the king. And then the accuser reports it, and then the royal minister says, bring that man to me, you can go home, we'll deal with him. And so then the royal minister calls up the thief and says, okay, you committed that thief, extend your hand, extends the hand, gives him a little slap and says, don't do that anymore. Okay, so that is how the master thief is able to commit robberies and get away with the robbery. And so, possessing three qualities, an evil bhikkhu maintains himself in a maimed and injured condition, is blameworthy and subject to reproach by the wise, and generates much demerit. What three? Here an evil monk depends on the uneven, on thickets, and on powerful people. Okay, so how does an evil monk depend on the uneven? The evil monk engages in unrighteous bodily, verbal, and mental action. How does he depend on thickets? The monk holds a wrong view, an extremist view. Actually, there seems to be some difference here, especially with the third one, because the third one is explaining how the evil monk gets away with his crimes without being, well, gets away with his misbehavior without being subject to any kind of punitive action. Okay, so how does the evil monk depend on powerful people? Here the evil monk depends on kings or royal ministers, thinking, if anyone accuses me of anything, these kings or royal ministers will dismiss the case. And so if anyone accuses him of anything, then the kings or royal ministers dismiss the case. So actually, I think it seems to me that the first two are really explaining how the evil monk maintains himself in this maimed condition, is blameworthy and subject to reproach by the wise, and generates demerit. But the third one is explaining how the evil monk commits evil deeds without coming up for any kind of punishment. Okay, any questions on these suttas? Are they still in Parliament? I don't know.
And who's in Parliament, so they could get away with the highest crimes.
So Bhante, it seems here that when you translate these three techniques that a master thief depends on, and how a monk may use them, does it mean that in the first one he depends on, the uneven part means he's just a master of disguise or something?
I think it would have to imply that.
Yeah.
Because for the parallelism to hold, there would have to be three ways in which a monk avoids
Being
getting sort of
discovered.
caught and found out and brought up for reproach and punishment.
Yeah. And then the second one would mean that he basically just outright obfuscates the truth, or...
Yeah, that's, yeah. Otherwise the parallelism wouldn't hold. Okay, I want to move on to the next set of suttas. Now we come to a whole sort of subchapter of suttas dealing with the Buddha's, the Buddha's giving discourses to Brahmins. Okay, so in this sutta, some two Brahmins who were old, aged, burdened with years, and so forth, come to the Buddha and exchange greetings with him. And then they sit down and they say to him that we are now old, come to the end of our life, but we have not done anything good and wholesome, nor have we made a shelter for ourselves. Please let the Master Gautama teach us in a way that will lead to our welfare and happiness for a long time. Actually, here the Buddha doesn't really give teachings to them to help them in their old age. He just says, truly you are old, come to the end of your life, and you have not done anything good and wholesome. And he says, in this world is swept away by old age, illness, and death. But when the world is swept away by old age, illness, and death, when one has departed, it's bodily, verbal, and mental self-control that will provide a shelter, a harbor, an island, a refuge, and a support. Okay, now the verses are interesting, and I'll show you why. Okay, here the verses are supposedly spoken by the Buddha. So he says, life is swept along, short is the lifespan, no shelters exist for one who has grown old. Seeing clearly this peril in death, one should do deeds of merit that bring happiness. Then he goes on, when one departs this life, self-control over body, speech, and mind, and the deeds of merit one did while living lead to one's happiness. So you could see that in this sutta, the Buddha is instructing the Brahmins who have lived, at least according to their claim, they've lived their lives without doing anything wholesome or meritorious. So the Buddha is telling them, do meritorious deeds so that you will find happiness in your next life. But there's a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya. This is the first chapter, it's sutta number 3, in which there's a dialogue between a deity, a deva, who comes to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha himself. And here the deity speaks the verse, which is the same verse as the Buddha speaks here. He says, life is swept along, short is the lifespan, and so forth. One should do deeds of merit that bring happiness. Okay, then the Buddha takes up that verse spoken by the deity. The first 3 lines are the same, but then the last line is different. The last line, a seeker of peace should drop the world's bait. Yeah, if you could see in the Pali, the verse spoken by the deity says, Punyani kairata sukha vahani. So punya, these are meritorious deeds that one should do. And then the Buddha's verse says, Loka misang pajjahe, santi peko. So one's seeking santi, or Sanskrit shanti. This would be the peace of nibbana, or liberation. For that person, it's not enough to do deeds of merit that bring happiness, but that person should abandon pajjahe, loka misang. This is, loka is the world, and amisa is something material, and it comes to mean the bait that a fisherman would use to catch fish. And so this is sort of setting up a contrast between 2 types of people who have, maybe say, are receptacles for the Buddha's teaching. One would be the person who is on the gradual sort of step-by-step path, progressing in a step-by-step way. And so this person is not yet ready, not yet mature enough for liberation. So this person has to do deeds of merit that will be the support for progressing, for moving on in one's next existence to a happy life, and for meeting the conditions that will sustain that person in their spiritual endeavors. So I'd say, well, for all of us, we have to do meritorious deeds that will support us in this life and in future lives. But one who wants to go further and break out of the entire cycle of birth and death, it's not enough just to do deeds of merit. That person has to drop the world's bait. And what is the world's bait? Exactly, yeah. The pleasures of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and even the mind. And what is it that makes us to seek the world's bait? Yeah, craving. And so for that person, the task is to eliminate craving. And in fact, there is a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya which uses exactly this kind of imagery. Yeah, so this sutta speaks about the fisherman who casts a baited hook into a deep lake And then a fish who's looking for food would swallow it. And then that fish who swallows the fisherman's hook meets with calamity and disaster. And so then the Buddha says, in the same way, there are these 6 hooks in the world for the calamity of beings, for the slaughter of living beings. So what are these hooks? They are forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, and mental objects that are desirable, lovely, agreeable, pleasing, enticing, tantalizing. So if a monk seeks delight in them, welcomes them, and remains holding to them, then he is called one who has swallowed Mara's hook. But then one who does not delight in them, does not welcome them, that is called one who has not swallowed Mara's hook, who has broken the hook, demolished the hook, and Mara can't do with him what he wishes. Yeah.
There's the point where we do things for merit, but isn't there a stage where we just do things without seeking the merit?
Well, ideally one doesn't do something seeking the merit,
right,
but one does the good, wholesome deeds, and those deeds will bring merit. But one does the deeds with the understanding, this would be part of the mundane right view, that meritorious deeds lead to happiness and unwholesome deeds lead to suffering. Okay, let's move on to see if we could Okay, the opening part of the next sutta is the same, except this sutta again takes a mundane point of view, and it speaks about the benefits of giving. So when one's house is ablaze, it's the vessel that is taken out that will be preserved and that will be useful to you, not the one that stays behind, that's left behind and that gets burnt in the fire. And so, similarly, the world is blazing with old age and death, and so what becomes useful to us is what we take out by giving. And so again, when one departs, self-control over body, speech, and mind, and the deeds of merit one did while alive lead to one's happiness. Okay, any questions? Any more questions on the material covered so far? Okay, so let's try to move on then to the next sutta. Okay, so here a Brahmin comes to the Buddha and says, he uses the expression, a directly visible Dhamma, a directly visible Dhamma. The Pali here is I see, okay. Yeah, the Pali is Sanditthiko Dhammo. And this is the beginning of a series of terms describing the Dhamma that we use in the standard verse of homage to the Buddha. Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Sanditthiko, that the Buddha's teaching is said to be well proclaimed, Sanditthiko, directly visible, Akaliko, not taking time, Ehipassiko, inviting inspection, Opanayako, applicable to oneself, and Pachatang Veditabo Vinyuhi, something to be seen and realized by the wise. And so this Brahmin, apparently he's heard that's description of the Buddha's teaching as being sanditthiko, directly visible. And so he's asking, he comes to the Buddha and he asks, in what way is the Dhamma directly visible? So something that one could see and experience for oneself right here and now, not depending upon trust or faith in some teachings that or principles that are beyond one's immediate experience. And so what I would say is that this doesn't exhaust the full significance of the Buddha's teaching, that the Buddha's teaching is expounded against the backdrop of the teachings of karma, rebirth, multiple planes of existence. The ultimate aim is liberation from our bondage to the cycle of repeated birth and death. But I'm an ordinary person. I don't have the divine eye in which I can see those are the Deva worlds, those are the lower worlds. I don't see the results of my actions, and I don't even see them in this life, let alone in future lives. So what kind of sort of guarantee, or what is the collateral that the Buddha's teaching gives me that shows me that it's beneficial right here and now? Okay, so this is what the Buddha says. So he says, one excited or overcome by lust, with a mind obsessed by lust, intends or acts for his own affliction, for the affliction of others, and for the affliction of both, and he experiences suffering, discontent, and dejection in the mind. Okay, but when lust is abandoned, or at least when it's reduced, then he doesn't intend for his own affliction, the affliction of others, the affliction of both, and does not experience mental suffering and dejection. So that is one way in which the Dhamma is directly visible. Okay, a second way is in terms of hatred. Sometimes maybe it's not so immediately visible in regard to lust or craving. Because when people indulge their craving, then they get a lot of pleasure, no? So maybe I'm a little skeptical about that. But with hatred, I think it's almost universal that when hatred arises in the mind, then one will act in ways that bring, let's put aside affliction to oneself, but certainly affliction to others. And when hatred is there, one will experience mental misery and suffering and stress and discontent. But then when that hatred and anger, even when it's temporarily overcome, then I won't act in a way that leads to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, the affliction of both, and I won't experience that mental suffering and dejection. Then the same, I think we could see this so clearly and so tragically, the way this happens with hatred. Just the past couple of weeks, we have these mass murders throughout the United States. people's minds overcome by hatred, then they shoot, in one cases, people in the synagogue, Jewish people, killing, 12? Was it 12? 11 people? Then just a couple of days ago, shooting at a nightclub, killing 12 people, and then the guy kills himself. So obviously there's affliction of oneself as well as others. Okay, and then delusion. Of course, when we're deluded, then we might not recognize the affliction for ourselves, the affliction of others, but it's still there. But when delusion is abandoned, then one does not act for one's own affliction, the affliction of others, the affliction of both. So it's in that way that the Dhamma is directly visible, immediately perceptible. It invites one to come and see, it's applicable, and it's to be personally realized by the wise. Okay, I think we have to close for the day. Okay, but we could come back after the meal, let's say 12:15, and then we could take any questions that come up. Okay, so let us end with sharing the merits with the Devas, the Bhutas, the fair spirits, the Nagas, the dragon spirits, and all beings. Akasata chabumata deva naga mehitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mehitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mehitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhuta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Pavagopadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha asanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting. Okay, we could stand.